What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Frank had spent the better part of his 68 years convinced that his best days were behind him, that the spark of ambition, the fire of possibility, had long since flickered out and faded into an endless gray dusk. Sitting alone in his small kitchen in Cedar Springs, Michigan, the morning light filtered weakly through the worn curtains, illuminating the cracked linoleum floor and the chipped coffee mug in his hands. The radio was playing the morning news, but Frank barely heard it. His mind wandered over the years of quiet mornings much like this one, filled with regrets, lost chances, and the slow but steady sinking feeling of being forgotten. At one point, he had been a man who built things. A mechanic who could fix anything with a wrench and a little elbow grease. But that was a lifetime ago, a chapter closed and shelved. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled slightly with arthritis, and the once warm house felt colder, emptier. The neighbors waved politely but rarely stopped by anymore. His daughter, Emily, had moved to Chicago years ago and visits were few and fraught with awkward silences and unspoken words. Frank's days followed a predictable rhythm: pills, TV, sighs, and memories that hurt more than they healed. Yet on this morning, something on the news grabbed his attention. Elon Musk, the man who seemed to defy the limits of what was possible, had just announced a new invention, something so groundbreaking it was said to terrify world leaders. The news anchor's voice crackled with urgency, describing a technology that could change the very fabric of power and control on a global scale. Frank frowned. Elon Musk. That name had become synonymous with bold risks, with breaking barriers, with a refusal to accept the status quo. Here was a man in his 50s, shaking the foundations of the future while Frank sat trapped in his small kitchen, feeling like time had passed him by. Could it really be possible? Could change come this late in life? For the first time in years, a spark flickered inside Frank, a small flame of curiosity and hope. What if Elon's fearlessness wasn't just a sign of youth or genius but a message for people like him? What if he wasn't too old? What if he could still build something meaningful, still matter? The thought was almost laughable, but it was there. In that moment, Frank decided to listen more closely to this news, to the man who seemed to challenge everything about aging and limits. The radio shifted to a clip of Elon Musk speaking, his voice calm but charged with conviction. When you're no longer afraid of failing, when you stop believing that you're too old or too late, you open the door to the future. The future belongs to those who build it, no matter their age. Frank's grip tightened on his coffee mug. Those words felt like a challenge and an invitation. His heart beat a little faster. The world outside his window remained quiet and indifferent, but inside, something had shifted. He thought about the dusty toolbox in his basement, the one he hadn't opened in years. The one filled with old tools and half-finished projects that once gave him pride and purpose. That toolbox symbolized everything he had lost: dreams put on hold, skills forgotten, a self that seemed out of reach. But maybe it was time. Maybe, just maybe, the moment had arrived to reclaim more than memories. Frank leaned back in his chair and stared out the window, his mind racing through the possibilities, the fears, the doubts. Was it too late to start over? Could he really change? Could he matter again? The questions echoed louder than the morning news, but for the first time, they felt like doors, not walls. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. The radio host's voice broke through the quiet. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank smiled softly. What was his answer? He didn't know yet. But maybe this story, Elon Musk's story, his story, was about to teach him. The sun rose higher, casting a warmer light across the kitchen floor, and Frank stood slowly, a sense of purpose settling in his bones. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faint stirrings of something new, a fire that refused to be extinguished by age, by regret, or by fear. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered, "It's not over. It's just beginning." The world outside may be uncertain, even terrifying in its rapid changes, but inside Frank, a revolution was starting. A revolution of hope, of courage, and of daring to believe that no one is ever truly too old to build something extraordinary. Today, Frank was no longer just a man left behind by time. He was a man ready to rise. Frank had always been a man defined by his hands. Strong, calloused, steady hands that could fix engines, repair fences, and build furniture with a precision that came from decades of practice. He grew up in Cedar Springs, a small town where everyone knew your name, your business, and your past, good or bad. Back then, Frank's future looked wide open like the endless Michigan sky, full of promise and possibility. But life had a way of changing course quietly, one day at a time. He remembered when he was younger, working late in his dad's garage, grease-stained and proud, dreaming of opening his own shop someday. He was a man with ambition, stubbornness, and a heart that believed anything was possible. But somewhere along the way, those dreams got tangled in the realities of life. Marriage, bills, kids, and jobs that paid the rent but didn't fuel the soul. The business he finally opened, a small mechanic shop, flourished briefly but then faltered when a big chain moved into town. He had fought hard, but the world was changing faster than he could keep up. He sold the shop, the place where he'd poured his sweat and hope, and took a job fixing cars at a dealership. It paid less, but it was steady. Slowly, the fire inside him dimmed. More than the fading of his dreams, Frank felt the ache of lost connections. His wife, Linda, left 5 years ago, tired of the quiet resignation that had settled over their marriage. Emily, their daughter, grew up and moved away to the city, chasing a life that Frank felt he could no longer reach or understand. Family dinners turned into brief phone calls, then fewer calls until silence filled the spaces. Frank often sat in his living room, looking at old photos on the wall, a younger version of himself grinning next to his wife, Emily holding a baseball glove, summer days in the backyard full of laughter that now felt like a different lifetime. He thought about the words he never said, the apologies never made. The what-ifs that haunted him in the quiet hours. One memory stood out sharper than the rest, a summer afternoon 30 years ago when Emily had shown him the bicycle she'd just learned to ride. Frank had been so proud, his smile wide and his hands steady as he held the bike, letting her pedal free for the first time. That moment was his lost self, a time when hope was tangible, and the future seemed certain. Now, that image felt fragile, like a faded painting he longed to restore but didn't know how. The house was quieter than ever. The old tools in the basement gathered dust beneath tarps, reminders of a man who once built, created, and dreamed. Frank's body wasn't what it used to be. His knees ached with every step, and the doctor's words echoed in his mind, "Take it easy, Frank. Slow down. Your heart can't keep up with the pace you used to set." But slowing down felt like giving up, and giving up wasn't in Frank's nature, even if his body protested. He spent days drifting through routines that offered no real satisfaction, checking the mail, watching daytime TV shows, and sitting on the porch with a fading sense of purpose. Yet beneath the surface, a restlessness simmered. The spark he had felt that morning while listening to Elon Musk's words was not an isolated flicker, it was a warning flare. Something inside Frank was waking up, demanding attention, refusing to accept the quiet fading into invisibility. He thought about Elon, a man who had faced countless failures, setbacks, and skepticism but never stopped pushing the boundaries. Elon Musk, the man who built rockets and electric cars while the world doubted him. To Frank, Elon wasn't just a billionaire or a tech genius, he was a symbol, a living, breathing challenge to the idea that age, fear, or circumstance could stop someone from changing the world. Frank's daughter, Emily, often said he was stuck in the past, trapped by memories and regrets. Maybe she was right. But maybe there was something else, a chance to rewrite the story, even now. He recalled the last time Emily had visited. Their conversation had been strained, filled with silence and awkward pauses. Emily worked long hours and rarely spoke about her personal life. Frank wanted to reach out but didn't know how to bridge the gap that years of distance had widened. He worried he had lost her forever. Frank also carried the weight of physical decline. His doctor had warned him about high blood pressure and the dangers of pushing too hard. "You've got to take care of yourself," the doctor said, but Frank felt trapped between wanting to move forward and fearing his body might betray him. The loneliness was another silent enemy. Cedar Springs was a town where neighbors once leaned on each other, shared meals, and celebrated milestones together. Now, many had moved away, and those left behind were wrapped in their own quiet battles. Frank's only companion some days was his old dog, Max, whose aging eyes mirrored Frank's own. The emptiness of the house pressed in on him during long nights, the creaking floors and ticking clocks reminding him of time passing, relentless and unforgiving. Yet in this stillness, Frank found himself reflecting on what mattered most. The toolbox in the basement called to him like a lost friend. It wasn't just about fixing cars or building furniture. It was about reclaiming a part of himself that had been buried beneath decades of routine and resignation. That toolbox held the remnants of hope, creativity, and purpose. It was a symbol of who he was and who he might still become. Frank's regrets were not just about missed business opportunities or faded relationships, they were about the silence he had allowed to grow between himself and the world. He realized that his greatest fear wasn't aging itself, it was becoming irrelevant, forgotten, invisible. And yet, hearing Elon Musk's words that morning had cracked open a door. Maybe it wasn't too late to step through. Maybe he could find a way to build something again, not just with tools or machines, but with his life. Frank's thoughts drifted back to a summer long ago when he first discovered the joy of creating something with his own hands. It was a birdhouse, painted bright red and blue, that he had built with his father when he was a boy. That birdhouse still stood in his neighbor's yard, a small testament to beginnings and endings. He thought about the stories he could tell, the lessons learned too late, and the dreams shelved but not extinguished. He thought about Elon Musk again, the man who defied expectations, who saw failures as steps toward success, who embraced the future with an unyielding fire. Frank realized that Elon's story wasn't just about rockets or electric cars, it was about mindset, about daring to believe you still had something to offer no matter your age or your past. That realization stirred something deep inside Frank. A mixture of fear, excitement, and determination. The house no longer felt so cold. The silence was not quite so loud. For the first time in years, Frank felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile and small, but it was there. And that flicker was enough. Frank knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be doubts, setbacks, and moments of loneliness. But for the first time, he was ready to face them, to fight for a new beginning. He made a quiet promise to himself to open the toolbox the next day, to dust off the old tools, and to start building again, not just things, but a life that mattered. The past was a weight, but the future was an open door. Frank was ready to walk through it. The echoes of his lost self would guide him, not hold him back. Somewhere, deep inside, he was still the man who believed anything was possible. And maybe that was all he needed. Frank's mind had become a battlefield. Each morning, waking brought a familiar war. Hope wrestling with doubt, courage battling fear, the desire to change wrestling with the heavy weight of years spent feeling invisible. He had stared at the dusty toolbox in his basement for weeks now, the ache in his knees and the tiredness in his bones a constant reminder that time was slipping away faster than he could catch it. Is it too late? That question haunted him like a shadow that stretched longer with every passing day. His daughter Emily didn't believe in second chances, at least not for him. During her last visit, she had gently but firmly told him, "Dad, you need to slow down. This isn't the life you had once. You can't just pick up where you left off." Her words, meant to protect, felt like a verdict, a declaration that his best years were behind him and that trying to change now was futile. Even his doctor's warnings echoed the same message. Your heart can't take the strain, Frank. Take it easy. You're not the man you were in your 30s. Frank knew they were right in a medical sense. His body wasn't as strong, his reflexes not as quick. But the more they urged him to slow down, the more restless he became. Somewhere inside, a voice screamed, "I'm still here. I still matter." It was that voice that drew him one evening to his phone, scrolling through news clips and social media posts until he found an interview with Elon Musk that had gone viral. Elon's words were sharp and clear, like a hammer cracking open Frank's doubts. When you stop believing you're too old to make a difference, you open a door that leads to the future. Age is just a number, it doesn't define your potential. Frank paused the video, letting the words sink in. Could someone like Elon, who defied odds and expectations, really mean this for people like him? Elon wasn't just a symbol of youthful genius, he was a reminder that the fire inside doesn't have to die with age. The more Frank listened, the more that ember inside him sparked. Yet just as quickly as hope rose, the dark clouds of fear gathered. What if he failed? What if he tried and only proved everyone right? That time had passed him by. The nights were the hardest. When the house was silent, and the shadows grew long, Frank wrestled with himself. His mind circled back to old regrets, the business that collapsed, the marriage that ended, the daughter who seemed to drift further away every year. Was there anything left to build? Was there a place for him in this rapidly changing world? The community around Cedar Springs, while kind in its own way, sometimes felt dismissive of people like Frank, older folks who didn't fit the image of progress or innovation. The world seemed to celebrate the young and the new, the tech-savvy and the trendsetters, leaving behind those who had seen better days. Frank felt that weight deeply. One afternoon, while helping a neighbor carry groceries, he overheard a comment that cut like a knife: at their age, they should just slow down and enjoy retirement. It wasn't meant to be cruel, but it stung all the same. That moment crystallized the inner war Frank faced daily, the pull between wanting to live fully and feeling pushed aside by a society that seemed to say, "You're done." The relentless tide of news about Elon Musk's latest projects didn't help. Headlines screamed about Mars colonization, electric vehicles, and AI breakthroughs that promised to change humanity's future. Some articles even warned world leaders that Elon's newest invention could disrupt global power structures. Frank was fascinated but also terrified. What was this invention? How could a man who defied so many odds now terrify the most powerful people on Earth? For Frank, Elon's story was a mirror and a map. It showed what was possible but also highlighted the enormous challenges ahead. He remembered reading about how Elon faced bankruptcy, criticism, and disbelief at every turn, yet never gave up. Could Frank find that same resilience? The conflict inside him wasn't just about age, it was about identity and purpose. Could he redefine who he was beyond the roles of father, mechanic, and ex-husband? Could he become someone new, someone who built again, not just machines but meaning? The more Frank thought about it, the more he realized the battle was not just with others but within himself. His own fears were the loudest critics. Yet the spark Elon Musk ignited refused to be snuffed out. It whispered, "You can still matter. You can still create." On a cold evening, Frank sat by his window, watching the snow fall softly on the streets of Cedar Springs. The quiet was both a comfort and a torment. The memories of his lost youth mingled with the sharp sting of loneliness. He reached for his phone again, this time watching an Elon Musk podcast where Elon spoke candidly about failure, fear, and relentless perseverance. Fear is natural, but it shouldn't be a cage. Every failure is a lesson, a step forward. Age just means you've had more time to learn, not less time to try. Frank closed his eyes and took a deep breath. If Elon could face the world's scorn and still push forward, maybe Frank could too. The inner war raged on, but now a new force entered the fight, hope mixed with determination. He thought of the rusty toolbox in the basement, the half-finished projects and forgotten dreams. What if he dusted it off? What if he allowed himself one more chance? One small step, no matter how uncertain, could be the beginning of something greater. That night, Frank wrote in his journal for the first time in years. Not about regrets or past failures, but about possibilities. About a future where he wasn't invisible, where his hands still built, and where his heart still beat with purpose. He wrote down Elon's words, "The future belongs to those who build it, no matter their age." With that, Frank felt a fragile peace settle over him. The war inside wasn't over, but the tide was turning. The battle would be long and hard, but now he had a reason to fight. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would open that toolbox. He would begin again. The next morning, Frank woke up with a strange mix of nervousness and resolve pulsing through him. For weeks, he had wrestled with doubt and fear, but today he was determined to take the smallest step that could spark a new journey. The basement door creaked as he opened it, the stale smell of dust and old wood greeting him like a forgotten memory. The toolbox sat in a corner, covered with a faded tarp, its edges frayed with age. Frank hesitated for a moment, heart pounding, then peeled back the tarp. The tools gleamed dully in the weak light, wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, and hammers, each one a relic of a life once full of purpose and pride. He picked up a wrench, feeling the familiar weight in his hand. The metal was cold but solid, like an old friend reminding him he wasn't finished yet. The garage felt like a sacred space, a sanctuary where he could leave behind the noise of doubts and the judgment of others. Frank knew this wouldn't be a dramatic reinvention. It wouldn't be a rocket launch or a business empire overnight. It would be one small, deliberate choice, to build again. To reclaim a part of himself that had been lost to time and fear. He thought about Elon Musk's words ringing in his mind, "The future belongs to those who build it, no matter their age." With that, Frank set to work. He pulled out scraps of wood he had saved years ago and began sanding a small board, the grains rough beneath his fingertips. His hands trembled slightly, but he pushed through the stiffness and aches, determined to prove that he still had something to offer. As the day passed, the garage slowly transformed from a dusty storage space to a workshop alive with the sound of sawing and hammering. Neighbors passing by glanced curiously but said nothing. Frank didn't care. This was his moment, his choice to fight against the fading. He found an old blueprint he'd sketched years ago for a simple bird feeder. It wasn't grand, but it was something, a symbol of hope, a beginning. As he worked, Frank felt the familiar rhythm of creation settle over him, a quiet music that lifted his spirit. The aches in his body reminded him he wasn't as young as he used to be, but the fire in his heart burned brighter than it had in years. Later that afternoon, he took a break and sat on the porch, looking out at the quiet street. Max, his old dog, lay beside him, tail thumping softly. For the first time in a long while, Frank felt a flicker of pride. He was doing something real, something that mattered. That night, Frank pulled out his phone and searched for local community groups. He found an online forum for seniors interested in DIY projects and shared a photo of his bird feeder, accompanied by a short message, "It's never too late to build something new." The responses trickled in slowly, encouraging words, questions, stories from others who felt stuck but wanted to try again. For Frank, that small connection meant the world. He wasn't invisible after all. He wasn't alone. Over the next few days, Frank's routine changed. Each morning, he opened the garage door and set to work on small projects, fixing a broken chair, building a planter box, even repairing a neighbor's fence post. Every nail hammered, every board sanded, was a small victory against the feeling of fading away. The physical exertion was challenging, and some days his body protested fiercely, but he refused to quit. He reminded himself of Elon Musk's journey, the failures, the risks, the relentless push forward despite setbacks. One afternoon, Frank's phone buzzed with a message from Emily. She had seen his posts online. The message was short but filled with tentative warmth. "Dad, I'm proud of you. Keep going." That single text brought tears to Frank's eyes. It was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, the walls between them could begin to crumble. Inspired by Elon's example of relentless innovation, Frank began documenting his progress in a blog. He called it, "Building Again." Through his writing, he shared his fears, his small wins, and the lessons he learned. Readers from around the country started following his journey, leaving comments of support and shared stories of late-life reinvention. Frank was stunned. The man he had believed invisible was suddenly part of a community, connected by shared hope and courage. One evening, after posting a video of him assembling a birdhouse, Frank received a message from a local community center. They wanted to invite him to lead a workshop for seniors interested in DIY projects. The invitation was more than just a chance to teach, it was an opportunity to inspire others who felt forgotten or stuck. Standing in front of the group weeks later, Frank shared not just techniques but the message Elon Musk had unwittingly passed on, that age was not a limit but a new frontier. As he spoke, he saw the same spark in their eyes that he had felt in himself, a hunger for purpose, a refusal to fade quietly. That night, Frank felt something shift deep inside. The inner war had not ended, but a new force had taken root, belonging. The belief that he was still part of something larger, that his story mattered. Inspired by Elon's fearless mindset, Frank's small act of opening a toolbox had blossomed into a movement, a personal revolution against invisibility and resignation. He was no longer a man trapped by past regrets but a builder of new futures. And as the first snow of winter fell softly on Cedar Springs, Frank sat in his workshop, hands steady and heart full, ready to face whatever came next. The moment he chose to build again was the moment his life truly changed. Frank sat quietly in his small workshop, the warm glow of the single overhead light casting long shadows on the walls lined with tools and half-finished projects. Tonight was different. Tonight, the air seemed charged with something electric, as if the months of struggle and small victories had built to this moment of fragile triumph. It had started so simply, a dusty toolbox reopened, a bird feeder built piece by piece, a blog written with honesty and hope. But now, something bigger was unfolding. Just days ago, Frank's story had gone viral. A local reporter had stumbled upon his blog, captivated by the tale of a man who refused to fade into the background. The article spread like wildfire across social media, sparking a wave of encouragement from people around the country, stories of seniors finding new purpose, rekindling passions, defying the expectations of age and limitation. Frank was overwhelmed. Messages poured in. "You've inspired me to start my own project, thank you for showing me it's never too late, your courage is a light in a dark time." His inbox was flooded with invitations to speak, to share his journey, to lead workshops beyond Cedar Springs. But amid the triumph, there was vulnerability, the fear that this breakthrough could be fleeting, that old doubts would return like shadows creeping over a bright day. The night before his first major speaking engagement in a nearby town, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay awake, heart racing, wondering if he was really ready to stand in front of an audience and share his story. The ghost of years spent doubting himself whispered that he was a fraud, that he had nothing to offer but faded dreams. Yet the voice that had carried him this far, the spark lit by Elon Musk's fearless example, pushed back. "This is your moment," it said softly. "You've earned it." The next morning, Frank stepped onto the small stage of the community center, the bright lights warm against his face. The room was filled with faces both young and old, each person hungry for hope, for a story of transformation that felt real and possible. As he spoke, Frank poured out his heart, the regrets, the losses, the inner war that nearly consumed him. But more importantly, he shared the choice he made to fight back, to build again, to reclaim purpose. He talked about Elon Musk. Not as a distant billionaire, but as a symbol of relentless innovation and belief in the impossible. The audience listened, rapt and silent, as Frank described how even in his 60s, he found the courage to dust off an old toolbox and begin anew. After the talk, a woman in her 70s approached him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I lost my husband last year and felt like my life ended with him," she said. "But hearing your story makes me believe I can still find a reason to keep going." Moments like that made all the fear and doubt worthwhile. Frank realized that breaking through wasn't just about his own victory, it was about lighting the way for others. One afternoon, as Frank was finishing a planter box, his phone buzzed with a notification that shook him to his core. It was a message from Emily. Not just a text this time, but a video. She was smiling, a little awkward but genuine. "Dad, I watched your talk online," she said. "I'm proud of you. I want to be part of this. To rebuild what we lost." The tears came without warning. After years of silence, her voice felt like the warmest embrace. They talked for hours, bridging the gap time had carved between them. Emily shared her own fears and regrets, the pressures of life in the city, and how she'd longed for a connection with the father she thought she had lost. Frank felt the weight of years lift, replaced by the fragile hope of mending their fractured bond. Inspired by this breakthrough, Frank and Emily began working on a project together, restoring an old wooden bench from the park where they used to play when she was a child. Each plank they sanded and each nail they hammered was a step toward healing, a tangible symbol of renewed family ties. Frank found strength not just in building objects, but in rebuilding relationships. The community around him began to change too. Neighbors who once saw him as the quiet, fading man now came to him with questions, seeking advice, wanting to learn. The local hardware store offered to sponsor his workshops, providing materials and space for seniors eager to try their own hands at creating. Frank's life, once marked by silence and regret, was now filled with connection and purpose. Yet the journey was not without its tests. One evening, after a long day of work, Frank's heart raced and a sharp pain gripped his chest. The doctor's office confirmed what he feared: he needed to slow down, to rest, or risk serious consequences. It was a harsh reminder that his body was still fragile, that the battle against time was not easily won. But Frank refused to let this setback extinguish the fire. He adjusted his pace, listened to his body, and leaned on the support of friends, family, and his growing community. He learned to balance ambition with care, embracing the wisdom that came with age without surrendering to limitation. The breakthrough was not a single moment but an ongoing process, a dance between hope and reality, vulnerability and strength. One crisp autumn morning, as Frank and Emily placed the restored bench back in the park, a small crowd gathered. They applauded not just the bench, but the man who had refused to be forgotten. Frank looked around at the faces, young and old, and felt a profound sense of belonging. He realized that breaking through wasn't about proving something to the world, it was about reclaiming his own story, one small choice at a time. In that moment, Frank understood the true power of Elon Musk's example, that radical change often starts with a spark, a belief in possibility that refuses to be crushed by age, fear, or failure. Frank was no longer the man trapped by regret and silence. He was a builder, of projects, of hope, of new beginnings. And as the sun set over Cedar Springs, painting the sky in brilliant hues, Frank knew this was just the beginning. The story of a man who had been written off, but chose to write himself anew. The story of a life transformed not by grand gestures, but by the courage to build again. Frank sat on the weathered bench in the park, the same one he and Emily had restored together. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, wrapping around him like a familiar blanket. Around him, children played, couples strolled, and seniors gathered to share stories and laughter. It was a scene full of life, a stark contrast to the silence and loneliness that had once filled his days. As he watched, Frank felt a profound shift within himself, a quiet certainty that this moment was not an end but a beginning. The journey from fading into the background to becoming a beacon of hope had been long and winding. It had taken courage, resilience, and a willingness to embrace change despite the odds. But now, sitting here surrounded by community, purpose, and connection, Frank realized something deeper: he was crafting a legacy, not defined by wealth or fame, but by the lives he touched and the barriers he broke. He thought back to the years when he felt invisible, when the world seemed to say, "You're done." Those dark days still lingered in his memory, sharp reminders of how easy it is to give up, to accept that age means irrelevance. But Elon Musk's voice had been a beacon in the darkness, a challenge to rethink everything he believed about growing older. Age is just a number, it doesn't define your potential. Those words had sparked a fire that refused to die. Frank remembered the night he reopened the toolbox, the tentative first strokes of sanding wood, the blog that connected him to others. Each step was small, but together they built a bridge back to life. More than that, Frank's story had become a movement. Through his blog and workshops, he'd helped others see that it's never too late to start again, to create, to connect, to matter. The community center was now a hub for seniors eager to build, learn, and support each other. Frank's workshops were filled with laughter and the hum of saws and drills. The message was clear: age was not a barrier but a new frontier. Emily, too, was part of this new legacy. Their relationship, once fractured by silence and distance, had blossomed into a partnership rooted in understanding and shared purpose. Together, they dreamed of expanding their workshops, reaching more towns and cities, sparking change across the country. But the true legacy, Frank realized, was the transformation within himself. He was no longer defined by regret or loss but by the choices he made every day to keep building, not just objects, but a life of meaning and connection. One afternoon, as Frank walked through Cedar Springs, a young man approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Jenkins?" he asked. "I'm Mike, from the local high school. I've been following your story. I wanted to thank you. You showed me it's okay to fail and keep trying." Frank smiled, the warmth of that moment filling him with pride. "Keep building, Mike. It's never too late to start." Moments like that were the heart of Frank's legacy, the ripple effect of courage and hope spreading beyond the workshop walls. Frank also thought about the lessons Elon Musk had embodied throughout his journey: fearlessness in the face of uncertainty, relentless innovation, and a refusal to accept limits. While Elon built rockets and electric cars, Frank built bridges back to life and purpose for himself and others. Their stories were different but connected by the same thread of transformation. As winter approached, Frank and Emily planned a community event to celebrate their journey and invite others to join the movement. They called it the New Legacy Festival, a day of workshops, storytelling, and connection. The event was a huge success, drawing people from all walks of life. The energy was contagious, a testament to the power of one person's choice to build again. That night, as Frank stood before the crowd, he felt a deep sense of peace. He spoke from the heart, sharing not just his story but the truth he had come to live: "I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again. And I gave myself that permission." The applause was thunderous, but more than that, Frank felt the quiet knowing that this was only the beginning. His legacy was not about monuments or accolades but about the lives touched and the hope ignited. Back home, as snow blanketed Cedar Springs, Frank sat by the fireplace, Emily beside him, and Max curled at their feet. The journey had been hard, filled with fear and doubt, but also joy and connection. Frank's story was proof that transformation is possible at any age, that the future belongs to those brave enough to build it. And as he closed his eyes, Frank whispered a final thought, a promise to himself and everyone who had walked this path with him: the best is yet to come. Frank's newfound purpose brought light to his days, but with light came shadows, voices of doubt that clung to him like stubborn fog. Despite the warmth of community and the support from Emily, there were those who questioned his transformation, who saw his efforts as futile gestures in the face of aging. It began with whispers in the grocery store aisles and grew into pointed remarks from acquaintances who hadn't followed his story but knew the man he once was. "Why bother? You're past your prime," some said. "What's the use of building bird feeders at your age?" Others, more blunt, asked if he was chasing a foolish dream, wasting time better spent resting or accepting reality. These voices echoed the skepticism Frank had battled within himself for so many years. They were the chorus of a society uncomfortable with the idea that a man in his 60s could still reinvent, rebuild, and inspire. But Frank refused to let these doubts silence him. He thought back to Elon Musk's many battles, how the world mocked him when he dared to dream of rockets and electric cars, how leaders scoffed at his audacity. Elon's story was a roadmap for resilience, setbacks were not dead ends but part of the journey toward breakthrough. One afternoon, Frank sat at his kitchen table reading a particularly harsh comment left on his blog, "Stop embarrassing yourself. There's no glory in pretending you're young again." The word stung, threatening to unravel the fragile hope he had built. But instead of retreating, Frank took a deep breath and typed a response, not defensive but honest, "I'm not pretending. I'm proving that age is not a cage but a key to new beginnings." That reply became a turning point. Other readers rallied around him, sharing their own stories of late-life transformation and encouragement. The negativity did not vanish, but it no longer held power. Frank learned that facing doubters was part of the process, a test of conviction and courage. Meanwhile, Emily noticed Frank withdrawing sometimes, the old fears creeping in during quiet moments. She reminded him gently, "Remember why you started. You're not doing this for them. You're doing this for you, and for the people who believe in you." Frank held on to that truth tightly. He realized that change was never easy and that every step forward invited resistance. But he was no longer alone in the fight. One day, a letter arrived from a local politician, initially skeptical about Frank's work with seniors. The letter praised Frank's impact on the community and invited him to speak at an upcoming town hall meeting on aging and innovation. It was an unexpected validation. A bridge between grassroots hope and official recognition. Standing before the town hall crowd, Frank felt the weight of expectations but also the fire of purpose. He shared not just his story but the collective story of countless seniors battling invisibility and doubt. "We are not relics of the past," he declared. "We are builders of the future, no matter our age." The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. That moment crystallized Frank's belief that transformation was as much about changing minds as it was about changing lives. But the journey wasn't without setbacks. One evening, as Frank prepared for bed, a sharp pain seized his chest. The hospital stay that followed was a sobering reminder of mortality. Doctors urged caution, warning him to scale back. The message was clear: the body had limits. Yet Frank refused to let fear dictate his life. With Emily's support and careful medical guidance, he adapted his routine, focusing on projects that brought joy without strain, mentoring others, and continuing to write. This balance became a new form of strength. Throughout it all, Elon Musk's example remained a beacon. Frank admired how Elon embraced failure as feedback and kept pushing boundaries despite the odds. Frank embraced a similar mindset, seeing obstacles not as endings but as invitations to innovate his approach. Slowly, the doubters began to fade into the background, replaced by a growing chorus of supporters inspired by Frank's perseverance and authenticity. His story reached local media, schools, and senior centers, sparking conversations about the potential of aging as a time for reinvention rather than decline. And through it all, Frank held fast to one lesson: that true courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to move forward despite it. As winter thawed into spring, Frank walked through Cedar Springs Park, breathing in the fresh blooms. Children ran past, neighbors waved, and somewhere in the distance, the hum of a workshop echoed. Frank smiled, knowing that the fight against doubt was ongoing but that he was stronger than ever. He was no longer the man who felt forgotten and irrelevant. He was a symbol of resilience, a builder not just of bird feeders and benches but of hope, courage, and new legacies. And as the sun rose over the town, casting golden light on everything it touched, Frank knew one truth above all: the moment to matter was always now, no matter what anyone else said. The sun had barely risen over Cedar Springs when Frank's inbox began to overflow. He had posted a new blog entry the night before, a simple story about a man and his daughter restoring an old bench, but something about the tone, the vulnerability, the message of second chances had struck a nerve far beyond the town limits. Emails poured in from cities he'd never visited, from strangers who spoke like old friends. "Your story made me pick up a paintbrush for the first time in 20 years. I shared your post with my dad," he cried. "I thought my life was over at 70. You've made me wonder if maybe it's not." Frank stared at the screen, stunned. What started as a small act of defiance, opening a dusty toolbox, was now lighting fires across the country. The blog, once read by a few neighbors and Emily, had gone national, featured on a well-known podcast that covered stories of reinvention and resilience. A video clip of Frank's town hall speech, where he declared, "We are not relics of the past, we are builders of the future," had gone viral on social media. Tens of thousands of people had seen it. Tens of thousands had shared it. Frank had no idea how to process it. He wasn't a public speaker, not really. He wasn't trying to become famous. All he'd wanted was to stop feeling invisible, to matter to someone, even if that someone was just himself. And now, somehow, that small wish had grown into a movement. It wasn't just about Frank anymore. It was about a generation. Seniors across the country, some living alone, some in retirement communities, others with families who had quietly written them off, were writing to say they'd felt seen for the first time in years. The blog's comments section became a garden of rebirth, photos of a restored violin, a greenhouse rebuilt from scraps, an estranged son meeting his father again over coffee after reading Frank's story. There was even a man in Oregon who had started building model rockets with his grandchildren after being inspired by both Frank and Elon Musk's shared belief in dreaming big, no matter your age. Frank felt something deep and sacred forming, a kind of permission ripple. It was as if people had just been waiting for someone, anyone, to go first. Frank had gone first. Now the spark was spreading. In the weeks that followed, invitations came not just from community centers but from universities, innovation labs, podcasts, and even a documentary crew looking to explore stories of late-in-life reinvention. One day, Frank received a short, unexpected email. The subject line simply read, "From Elon's team." He stared at it for a long time before clicking. The message wasn't long, a few lines of thanks from someone on Elon Musk's media team who had seen Frank's story and passed it along to Elon himself. "He read your blog. He asked us to tell you, keep building. The world needs more people who won't stop just because it's hard." Frank's hands shook. Elon Musk had read his words. A man who had built rockets and companies that terrified world leaders had taken a moment to acknowledge the work of a retired mechanic from a small town. It didn't feel real. But it was. That short message was all the validation Frank needed to push even harder. He and Emily launched a new initiative called the Late Bloomers Project, a nonprofit aimed at giving older adults across America access to tools, workshops, and mentorship programs. It wasn't about productivity. It was about purpose. About giving people over 60 the resources to rediscover their creativity, rebuild broken relationships, and reclaim their sense of meaning. The response was overwhelming. Donors came forward. Volunteers offered their time. Former CEOs, teachers, and artists, all past what society often labeled as their prime, stepped up to say, "I'm not done either." Frank had to step back at times to catch his breath. The physical toll of running workshops, managing emails, and traveling to speaking engagements wore him down. He paced himself, trusting his team, and letting Emily take the lead when needed. But even as he rested, the fire never went out. The ripple effect continued. Stories flooded in from across the world. A woman in Ireland started teaching sewing classes to local widows. A man in South Korea rebuilt his father's old boat. A couple in Brazil turned their backyard into a community garden after being inspired by Frank's belief that building isn't just about tools, it's about healing. Frank kept returning to Elon Musk in his mind, not the celebrity version, but the relentless thinker who never seemed to accept that anything was impossible. Frank didn't idolize Elon. He respected him. Elon hadn't given him a path, he'd given him a spark. The courage to ask, why not, when the world said, don't bother. That was the real catalyst. Frank remembered an old Elon interview where he said, "You get paid in direct proportion to the difficulty of the problems you solve." But Frank saw it differently now. Life paid you back in direct proportion to the love and truth you put into solving the right problems. And the right problem, for him, had never been global tech or Mars or money. It was this: how do you help people believe they still matter? That became Frank's mission. The Late Bloomers Project expanded into 10 states within the year. Frank's face appeared in magazines. A major news network ran a segment titled, "The Man Who Reminded America That It's Never Too Late." But none of it changed who he was. He still walked Max every morning. He still used the same tools. He still sat on the same bench with Emily and watched the seasons change. One evening, Frank looked at her and said, "I never imagined all this. I just wanted to feel alive again." Emily smiled and replied, "You didn't just find your life, Dad. You gave it to thousands of people." That night, Frank wrote a new blog post. It wasn't long. Just a few words, typed slowly with purpose. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for someone to tell you it's okay to begin again. Start with one thing. One step. One choice. The world doesn't need you to be young. It needs you to be brave. The post went viral again. But this time, Frank didn't watch the metrics. He didn't need to. He already knew the spark was out there, spreading like fire in dry grass. And all he had to do was keep building. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank never saw himself as the kind of man who'd be asked to sit on a panel next to tech entrepreneurs and former astronauts, but there he was, backstage at a National Innovation Summit in Chicago, adjusting the sleeves of a slightly too new jacket while the hum of the crowd beyond the curtain filled the air like static. He wasn't nervous exactly, but there was a strange surrealness to it all. Only a year ago, he'd been sitting alone in his house, staring at the quiet kitchen table, wondering what it would feel like to matter again. Now his name was on the program: Frank Jenkins, founder, the Late Bloomers Project, a movement of purpose after 60. He couldn't help but smile. He wasn't famous in the traditional sense. He wasn't rich, young, or digitally savvy. But people were listening. And not just politely, really listening. Waiting for what he had to say. He thought of Elon Musk's story again, how every risk had started with an idea no one else believed in. Electric cars. Reusable rockets. Frank had his own impossible idea, that life after 60 could be the most powerful chapter yet. The moderator introduced the panelists, and when Frank's name was called, applause erupted from the crowd. He stepped into the lights, shielding his eyes for a moment, and found his seat beside a woman who just launched a space tech firm. The contrast wasn't lost on him. When it was his turn to speak, the moderator asked, "Mr. Jenkins, what inspired you to start this movement?" Frank leaned forward slightly and said, "Honestly, I was tired of feeling like a ghost." The room went still. I had dreams once. Skills. A family. Then life happened, and slowly, I started to fade, like a book people had stopped reading. Then one day I heard a clip of Elon Musk saying, "The future belongs to those who build it." And I thought, what if I'm not done building? What if I've got one more thing in me? There was silence again, then a soft swell of applause. Frank continued, his voice steady, "The Late Bloomers Project isn't about productivity. It's about dignity. About showing people that you don't need to be 25 to change your life or someone else's." After the panel, dozens of people came to shake his hand. Some were investors. Some were educators. But most were ordinary people, sons, daughters, caregivers, thanking him for reminding them that their parents, their neighbors, even themselves, still had value. On the train back to Cedar Springs, Frank sat quietly, the city lights blurring past the window. He felt a peace in his chest he hadn't known in decades, not pride exactly, but wholeness. He hadn't set out to change the world. But maybe by changing his own small corner of it, he had. Back home, the workshop was just as he'd left it. The smell of sawdust and oil. The soft thud of Max's tail wagging against the floor. A coffee mug with half-finished ideas scribbled on a napkin nearby. Emily was waiting with dinner already started, her smile wide and knowing. "You did good, Dad," she said. "No," he replied, hanging up his coat. "We did good." As the days passed, the requests grew. More towns wanted to start late bloomers chapters. Colleges asked if Frank would consider co-developing curriculum. One retired professor sent a message, "You've sparked a cultural shift, Mr. Jenkins. Seniors don't want to be seen as fading. They want to be seen as evolving." Frank read that line again and again, evolving. That's what this was. Not a second act. Not a final chapter. Just another evolution. But not everyone celebrated the change. A major news anchor, during a primetime segment, scoffed at the idea of old folks playing entrepreneur, calling it a charming distraction from reality. Frank didn't flinch. He responded with a public letter, posted to the blog, "This isn't about charming distractions. It's about survival. Purpose keeps people alive. Connection keeps us human. If that makes you uncomfortable, good. Maybe that means we're doing something right." The post trended for 3 days. Seniors everywhere started using the phrase, "still building," as a rallying cry, on t-shirts, banners, community events. Frank watched it grow with a kind of sacred awe, knowing that something bigger than himself had taken root. One spring morning, a package arrived at Frank's door with no return address. Inside was a framed photo, Elon Musk, standing beside a launch pad, with a handwritten note across the bottom that read, "Still building. Keep going. Elon." Frank sat down slowly, hands trembling. He stared at the photo for a long time, the words sinking in like rain into thirsty soil. He wasn't chasing Elon. He wasn't trying to be Elon. But they were connected in some invisible way, two men who refused to stop asking what if, even when everyone else said, "Don't bother." That photo went up in the workshop. Not as an idol, but as a reminder, the spark had to keep moving. Frank didn't want to just inspire. He wanted to ignite. So he began visiting places others avoided, hospice centers, underfunded senior homes, VA hospitals, anywhere aging felt like exile. He gave talks. Held workshops. Listened. And what he heard broke his heart wide open. So many seniors weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of disappearing before they died. Frank knew that fear too well. But now he also knew the antidote. He handed them hammers, paintbrushes, notebooks. Helped them build small things. A birdhouse. A journal. A garden bed. Start here, he told them. Start small. Start now. He saw people come back to life in those rooms. A woman who hadn't spoken in months started sharing stories from her childhood as she painted. A man in a wheelchair sketched out plans for a community chess table. Purpose didn't cure age. But it gave it meaning. And meaning was everything. One night, after a long drive home, Frank sat on the porch with Emily. The stars were bright, the air warm with the scent of pine. He looked at her and said, "You think people like me were supposed to change the world?" She laughed softly. "Maybe not supposed to. But you did anyway." Frank smiled. "It still feels like I'm just a guy who builds bird feeders." "Maybe," she said. "But you built something bigger, too. A reason." He nodded slowly, staring out into the dark. Funny. All it took was saying yes to one small thing. The wind moved through the trees, and for a moment, everything was still. Frank thought of all the people out there now, picking up tools for the first time in years. Calling old friends. Writing letters. Starting again. Not just because of him. But because he'd gone first. Because he'd dared to say, "I'm not done." And as long as breath filled his lungs and ideas sparked in his chest, Frank knew one thing for certain. He would keep going. Keep building. Keep believing that the future didn't belong to the young or the old. It belonged to the brave. Frank stood in front of the old church-turned-community center in Louisville, Kentucky, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a dull ache in his knees that reminded him he'd been traveling more in the past 6 months than he had in the previous 10 years combined. The place was packed with people, seniors, students, volunteers, all buzzing with energy. Another late bloomers chapter had opened here, built by locals inspired by the blog and determined to bring purpose back into lives that had been put on the shelf. Frank smiled as he stepped inside. There was that same familiar smell of wood, glue, and coffee. The same buzz of tools and laughter and soft piano music playing from someone's old Bluetooth speaker in the corner. And yet, underneath it all, something inside Frank felt heavier than it used to. Not just his joints. Not just the exhaustion from late flights and endless messages and planning. It was something deeper, an invisible weight pressing against his chest. He had built so much. Inspired so many. But lately, he'd started to wonder if he'd stretched himself too far, too fast. Back in Cedar Springs, Emily had noticed it first. The way he rubbed his temples more often. The way he paused during dinner and stared off like he was hearing something only he could understand. "You okay, Dad?" she'd asked one night. He'd nodded, smiled, changed the subject. But even Frank couldn't deny it anymore. The cost of courage was beginning to show. He was tired. And he didn't just mean physically. He was tired of carrying the movement. Tired of being the story everyone turned to. Tired of being the proof that reinvention was possible, because sometimes, the truth was, he didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like an old man with a body that groaned every morning and a heart that sometimes wondered if maybe the fire was flickering. Still, he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not yet. He gave his talk to the Louisville crowd, told the story about the bird feeder and the first blog post, about the photo from Elon and the seniors in Oregon building rocket kits in their garages. The room lit up with applause. People cried. They thanked him. But afterward, when the crowd filtered out and the chairs were being stacked, Frank sat alone by a window, staring at the street lamp glow on the sidewalk. For the first time in a long time, he questioned whether he still had it in him. Was it enough to have sparked the fire? Or was he supposed to carry it forever? A soft knock on the window beside him startled him. A boy, maybe 13, held up a notebook with shaky handwriting scrawled across the page. "You made my grandpa want to live again." Frank stared at it, blinking fast. He opened the window. "Where's your grandpa now?" The boy pointed to a man across the street, leaning on a cane, waving gently. "He built a birdhouse yesterday," the boy said. "He hadn't touched a tool in 20 years. Said you made him feel like he still mattered." Frank nodded, words caught in his throat. "Tell him, thank you. For reminding me why I started." The boy grinned and ran off. That night, Frank lay in the hotel bed, the soft hum of the AC masking the quiet ticking in his brain. He knew something had to change. He couldn't keep carrying the entire movement on his shoulders. It had to grow beyond him. And maybe that was the next brave thing, to let go. To pass the torch. To believe that what he'd started was strong enough to survive without him at the helm. The next morning, he called Emily. "I think I need to come home for a while," he said. "I think I need to rest." She didn't hesitate. "I was hoping you'd say that." A week later, back in Cedar Springs, Frank walked through the community garden behind the workshop. The flowers were in bloom. Raised beds full of vegetables stretched into the late summer sun. Seniors he'd once taught were now leading their own classes. One man was teaching woodworking to local kids. A woman in her 70s had launched a podcast interviewing other late bloomers. The movement was alive. Frank sat on the bench he and Emily had restored, breathing in the warm air. He didn't need to be in Chicago or Louisville or on another podcast. The spark had already caught. He didn't need to keep proving it. It was happening without him, and that, more than anything, meant he'd done it right. That week, he drafted a post titled "The Cost of Courage." It read, "We talk a lot about starting over. About building again. But what we don't always talk about is the weight that comes with it. The expectations. The pace. The pressure. If you feel tired on your journey. If you've dared to start again and now wonder if you have the strength to keep going, you're not alone. The cost of courage is real. But so is the reward. And sometimes, the bravest thing isn't to push harder. It's to pause. To rest. To trust that the fire you lit will keep burning, even when you step away from the match." That post received more responses than anything Frank had written. Messages of relief, of gratitude, of people saying, "I thought I was weak for needing a break." Frank had shown them again, he wasn't a superhero. He was real. And that made his courage even more powerful. In the weeks that followed, Emily helped him restructure the nonprofit. Others stepped into leadership. The movement didn't shrink. It flourished. New chapters formed. A documentary premiered. Elon Musk tweeted a link to one of Frank's speeches with the caption, "We need more minds like this. Age is irrelevant. Energy is everything." Frank smiled when he saw it. Not because Elon had noticed again, but because he no longer needed him to. The validation had always been inside. Cedar Springs became a pilgrimage site of sorts, a place where older adults came to be reminded of what was possible. Frank still held a hammer now and then, still taught small classes, still sat on the bench and listened. But he no longer had to carry the movement. It had become a shared song. One day, a young woman who'd driven cross-country with her father came up to Frank and said, he was going to check into assisted living last year. He said he was done. Then I showed him your story. Now he's teaching guitar again. Frank nodded, his eyes wet. That's the power, he said quietly. It's not in what we build. It's in what we reignite. As she left, Frank looked up at the sky, at the wide blue canvas above Cedar Springs, and whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular. Just to the journey itself. To the cost. And the reward. He had lit a match in the dark. And the fire still burned. Frank stood in the center of his workshop, burly light streaming through the high windows, dust motes floating like tiny spirits in the air. The space was quieter these days, but not silent. Tools still hummed, wood still splintered beneath saws, and laughter still echoed from the community room where a group of newly retired teachers were building a lending library box shaped like a rocket ship. Frank smiled at the absurdity and the beauty of it. A year ago, he would have thought the whole idea was too much, a fantasy cooked up by someone afraid of reality. Now, he knew better. What seemed far-fetched at first had become a way of life. A new ecosystem of late bloomers. He moved slowly as he walked toward a shelf near the back, fingers trailing along familiar tools. His body was slower now, hips stiffer, hands more tired in the morning, but his mind still flickered with fire. And today, something had returned to him. Not just inspiration. A memory. A plan. He reached the shelf and pulled down an old box, the cardboard edges worn, the corners taped and retaped. He hadn't opened it in years. It was labeled in sharp black marker, Drone Project, 1997. Frank carried the box over to the bench and opened it carefully. Inside were sketches, notes, photos, his first attempt at building a lightweight drone system before drones were even really a thing. He remembered pitching it at a regional fair in the late 90s, only to be laughed off by investors who saw no need for flying cameras in civilian life. Toys, they had said. Gimmicks. He'd buried the plans after that. Life got busy. Bills piled up. His wife got sick. Then time did what it always does, it smoothed everything down to a quiet ache. But the ache was still there, tucked into a box like this one, waiting. Frank gently lifted out the blueprints and unrolled them. The edges cracked slightly, but the ink held. The design wasn't brilliant. It wasn't revolutionary. But it was his. He studied the drawings, fingers tracing over his own notes: make lighter. Balance issue on rear rotor. Try alternate battery mount. He shook his head, half laughing, half grieving. You really thought you were gonna change the world back then, he murmured. But even as he said it, he felt the flicker. The old version of himself, the one who dreamed beyond his means, was still here. Still building. Later that afternoon, Emily stopped by with 2 iced teas and a small bag of cookies. She found Frank hunched over the bench, blueprints sprawled out like an ancient treasure map. "What is this?" she asked, smiling as she set the drinks down. "A blast from the past. You remember that drone project I used to talk about? The one I tried to get going back in the day?" Emily nodded. "You mean the one you wouldn't stop ranting about at Thanksgiving '97? Frank chuckled. "That's the one. I was thinking," he paused, lifting a part from the schematic. "What if I built it now? Not because the world needs another drone, but because I never let myself finish it." Emily looked at him, then at the blueprints. "You really think you still want to?" He nodded. "I do. Not because it'll make headlines. Not because anyone's asking for it. Just because I want to see it fly." She sat beside him. "Then let's make it fly." That week, Frank dove back into the project like a man possessed. He studied updated drone tech, ordered parts online, consulted forums where teenagers and engineers exchanged tips and war stories. He wasn't trying to compete with modern developers, he just wanted to bring his old idea to life, using both the wisdom of age and the tools of now. Volunteers from the Late Bloomers project offered help. Some had engineering experience. Others just wanted to watch, to learn, to be part of something. Frank welcomed them all. They set up a corner of the workshop dedicated solely to old blueprints, inviting others to bring in unfinished projects from their pasts. A woman brought in a half-written novel from 1983. A man rolled in an old keyboard synthesizer he'd built but never programmed. A couple brought plans for a treehouse they'd promised their kids 40 years ago. The workshop became a museum of what-ifs being rewritten into what now. Frank's drone came together piece by piece, with newer parts filling in the gaps where his old design fell short. He didn't treat it as a sacred relic, he adapted. He learned. He grew. The first test flight was rough. The drone buzzed upward, tilted hard left, and crashed into a pile of lumber. Everyone winced. Frank laughed. "She's got attitude," he said. "I like her already." The second flight went better. The third was perfect: smooth lift, stable hover, a slow, confident circle around the rafters. The room erupted in cheers. Frank stood, remote in hand, eyes shining. "I did it," he whispered. 28 years later, and I finally did it." That moment sparked something deeper in him than any speech or blog post ever had. Because this wasn't for anyone else. This was for the man he used to be. The one who had dared to dream something wild and impractical, and who had now, finally, honored that dream. A local journalist came to cover the story, thinking it would be a puff piece. But by the time she left, she was crying. "This isn't about drones," she said, snapping photos of the old blueprint sign. "This is about unfinished business. About proving to yourself that it's never too late to matter to you." The story made national news again, not because Frank had built a drone, but because thousands of people resonated with the idea of finally finishing something they'd buried years ago. People started sending in their own blueprints. Designs. Dreams. Photos of projects long forgotten. The Late Bloomers Project launched a new initiative. The Unfinished Archive. A database where seniors could submit lost dreams and get matched with volunteers to help bring them to life. A retired architect in Arizona was paired with a young grad student to design a community center. A former dancer helped choreograph a performance with local teens. A man who'd once dreamed of being a pilot was invited to fly a small plane for the first time at 74. Frank's drone, which he named Echo, became a symbol, not of tech, but of truth. Of all the things we bury under the rubble of time and responsibility. Of the blueprints we leave behind when we convince ourselves it's too late. Elon Musk shared the story with a caption that read, "The world runs on unfinished dreams. Build yours anyway." Frank printed it out and taped it on the wall above the drone. He didn't need Elon's approval, but it reminded him that his fire had started with a spark from someone else's courage. Now it was his turn to pass it on. Sitting on the bench with Emily one evening, he turned to her and said, "I thought it would be the speaking or the blog that changed everything. But it was this. Coming back to something I left behind." She smiled, resting her hand on his. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do isn't starting something new, it's finishing something we thought we'd lost. Frank nodded, the last rays of sun warming his face. Around him, the sounds of the workshop, of people dreaming and building and rediscovering, filled the air like music. Echo sat perched on the workbench, quiet now, but full of promise. And Frank? He was already thinking of what he might build next. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when the letter arrived. Not an email. Not a DM or a tweet. A real letter, thick envelope, hand-addressed, slightly bent at the corners like it had traveled a long way just to find him. Frank found it among the usual pile of mail, bills, a hardware catalog, some flyers, and nearly tossed it aside. But something about the handwriting stopped him. It wasn't familiar, but it wasn't entirely foreign either. Cursive. Deliberate. The kind people didn't bother with much anymore. He sat down at the kitchen table with his coffee and slit the envelope open slowly, almost reverently, as if he already knew this wasn't just another piece of correspondence. He unfolded the letter, and at the top was a name he hadn't spoken out loud in more than a decade. Michael. His son. Frank's heart slammed into his ribs. His hands went cold. For a moment, the words on the page blurred and he had to blink hard to clear them. He hadn't heard from Michael in over 15 years, not since the fight. The real, brutal, soul-tearing kind of fight that scars over but never really heals. He had said things he regretted. Michael had too. Then there was distance. Then silence. Years of silence. Years where Frank convinced himself he didn't deserve reconciliation, that the damage had already calcified into something permanent. But now here it was, his son's handwriting, right in front of him. He took a shaky breath and began to read. Dad. I've been following your story. At first, I didn't want to. When the late bloomers thing started gaining attention, I figured it was just another way for you to be in the spotlight. You always wanted to build things, fix things, change the world. But I never thought you knew how to fix what was right in front of you. That's how I used to see it, anyway. But then I watched your speech from Louisville. The one where you said the cost of courage is real. And for the first time in years, I saw you, not the version I carried with me in anger, but the version that looked a lot like me. Tired. Trying. Human. You said in that talk that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop pretending you're not hurt. That you're not lonely. That you don't wish things had gone differently. So I'm writing this because I don't want to pretend anymore. I was angry for a long time. But under that anger was sadness. Grief. And I think maybe you felt that too. You're doing good work, Dad. And I'm proud of you. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Michael. Frank sat back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hands. His chest hurt, not in a medical way, but in the way that only happens when something old and frozen begins to thaw. He read the letter again. Then a third time. The words didn't change, but they grew heavier with each reading. Michael was reaching out. After all this time. After everything. Frank looked up at the ceiling, blinking away the tears that had come uninvited and unstoppable. For years, he had buried the hope that this might happen. Told himself he was too late. That some things stayed broken. But maybe not. Maybe healing, like building, didn't have an age limit either. That evening, Frank sat down at his desk with a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. He hadn't handwritten a letter in years. Emails were easier. Quicker. But this needed weight. This needed time. He began slowly. Michael. I read your letter 3 times before I could breathe right again. I don't know what to say except I'm sorry. For all of it. For how I hurt you. For not showing up when I should have. For making you feel like I was building everything but our relationship. You were right to be angry. I was angry too, at myself, mostly. But I couldn't say it then. I didn't know how. I've spent a lot of time talking to strangers lately about starting over. But this, writing to you, this is the real restart. The one that matters more than anything else I've done. I'd like to talk. Really talk. Whenever you're ready. Love, Dad. He folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and stared at it for a long moment before sealing it. His hands still shook. He wasn't sure what would come next. But he had written the words. And that was more than he'd thought possible just a day ago. A week passed. Then another. No reply. Frank went about his days, working in the shop, hosting small groups, helping others finish their old projects. But his mind kept drifting back to Michael. Every time the mail came, his heart lurched a little. Then, one morning, a number flashed across his phone screen. Unknown. But something about it felt known. He hesitated, then answered. Hello. A pause. Then, hi, Dad. Frank froze. Michael's voice was deeper now, wearier maybe, but unmistakable. Hey, Frank said softly. It's good to hear your voice. Yours too. Another pause. Then, I got your letter. Frank waited. I've read it a bunch of times, Michael said. I wasn't sure if I should call. But, here I am. Frank nodded, even though his son couldn't see him. I'm glad you did. They talked for over an hour. Not about the past, not right away. They started with simple things. Work. Life. The drone project. Michael had seen the story on TV and read about Echo. He was curious. Impressed. Tentative. But open. Toward the end of the call, Michael said, I'm coming through Cedar Springs next month. Thought maybe we could get coffee. Frank swallowed hard. I'd like that. A lot. After the call ended, Frank sat in silence, hands folded. He didn't cry this time. He just breathed. For the first time in years, he felt the presence of something long lost returning to him, not just a son, but a second chance. The workshop buzzed on around him. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Inside, his heart, once heavy with regret, felt lighter. Not fixed. Not perfect. But open. Healing had begun. Not just in the world he'd helped spark, but in the one place that had always mattered most, his family. Because for all the speeches, the blueprints, the flights of Echo and the cheers of strangers, nothing compared to that one simple truth. The future wasn't built in wood and metal alone. It was built in letters. In apologies. In finally saying what needed to be said. Frank knew now, this was what it meant to really matter. And he was ready for whatever came next. The small bell above the cafe door jingled as Frank stepped inside, a gust of cool morning air following him. The place hadn't changed much since he'd last visited it: wooden beams across the ceiling, chalkboard menus, the faint hiss of steamed milk from the espresso machine. It was quaint, cozy, and packed with locals. He spotted the table near the back, the one next to the bookshelf filled with mismatched paperbacks and board games missing half their pieces. That's where he was supposed to meet Michael. His hands trembled slightly as he rubbed them together for warmth. It had been nearly 20 years since he'd last seen his son in person, and now, in just a few minutes, they'd be sitting face to face. Not as strangers, not exactly, but as something much more fragile, people trying to rebuild something long broken. Frank took a deep breath and ordered 2 coffees. "Black," he said. "And one with oat milk, no sugar." He wasn't sure if that was still Michael's preference, but he remembered it from a long-ago road trip when Michael was in college and refusing to drink whatever garbage was in the office pot. The barista gave him a curious look. "Meeting someone?" "Yeah," Frank said softly. "Someone important." He carried the cups to the table, set them down, and waited. The minutes ticked by slowly. Each sound, door opening, chairs scraping, laughter from the baristas, made his heart jump. Then he saw him. Michael. Taller than he remembered. Gray at the temples now. But the same posture, the same stride, the same eyes, serious, observant, quietly taking in the room. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Then Michael smiled. It was cautious, but real. Frank stood up. "Hey," he said. "Hey, Dad." They embraced. It was short, slightly awkward, but it was an embrace, a real one. And when they pulled apart, something unspoken passed between them. A kind of mutual agreement: we're here. We're trying. They sat down. "You remembered my coffee," Michael said, picking up the oat milk cup. "Wasn't sure you still drank it like that," Frank replied. "Some things change," Michael said. "Some don't." They both laughed, soft, unsure, but it broke the tension. They talked for an hour. Then 2. At first, it was surface level: jobs, weather, recent books, travel. But gradually, layer by layer, the conversation deepened. Frank told him about the drone project, the bird feeder, the first time he dared to write again. Michael listened closely. "You always did have a thing for unfinished business," he said, smiling. Frank nodded. "And now I finally understand why it haunted me so long." Michael looked down at his coffee. "I had unfinished business too," he said quietly. "Anger. Resentment. I thought it protected me. But all it did was keep me stuck." Frank didn't speak right away. Then he said, "I was too proud to admit how much I missed you. And too ashamed to think you'd want to hear it." Michael looked up. "Well, I'm here now." Frank nodded, voice tight. "Yeah. You are." Another pause. Then Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. "I've been writing," he said. "Little thoughts. Ideas. Nothing serious. But after I saw what you were doing with the Late Bloomers project, I realized I missed creating things." He handed the notebook to Frank. "You might be the first person to read any of it." Frank opened it carefully. The pages were filled with sketches, fragments of essays, even a few poems. "This is good," he said. "It's honest." Michael shrugged. "It's a start." Frank handed the notebook back. "That's all it ever needs to be." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe continuing around them like a soft soundtrack. Frank stared at his son, older now, battle-worn, but still full of spark. He wondered how many versions of Michael he'd missed. Birthdays. Holidays. Late-night calls that never happened. But he didn't dwell. Not now. They were here. That was enough. As they walked out of the cafe together, Michael stopped on the sidewalk and looked around. You know, he said, I thought coming back here would feel like stepping into the past. But it doesn't. What does it feel like? Frank asked. Michael considered. Like we're finally in the same chapter again. Frank smiled. Maybe even writing it together. They made plans to meet again. A few weeks later, Michael visited the workshop. The place was buzzing with activity as always, seniors tinkering, volunteers organizing parts, a group of teens filming a documentary on late-in-life creativity. Michael took it all in with quiet awe. This is a lot bigger than I expected, he said. Frank chuckled. It started with a bird feeder and a broken man. Well, Michael said, it looks like you fixed more than just the man. They spent the afternoon building a model glider together. It was simple, made of balsa wood and glue, but it felt sacred. Side by side, father and son creating something, not for anyone else, not for press or praise, but for them. That evening, they launched the glider from the top of the workshop hill. It soared, dipped, caught an updraft, and flew further than either of them expected. Frank watched it glide and felt something loosen in his chest. Not grief, not regret, something brighter. Something like peace. As they walked back down the hill, Michael said, I've been thinking of starting a group. Like what you've done. For people my age. Mid-40s, 50s. Not quite young, not quite old. Still searching. Frank looked at him, eyebrows raised. You're serious? Why not? I've got all these ideas now. That letter I sent you. It cracked something open. I want to help people the way you helped me, without even realizing it. Frank stopped walking. That might be the best sentence I've heard all year. Michael laughed. You always said the future belonged to the builders. Frank nodded. It still does. A month later, Michael launched his project, Reframers. A movement for people navigating the middle, career changes, divorces, redefinitions of identity. Late bloomers and reframers formed a natural partnership. Workshops. Shared events. Storytelling nights where generations came together and told the truth, their truth. Frank watched it unfold with a kind of quiet joy. Not because he needed credit. But because this was how it was always supposed to be. A ripple effect. A lineage of courage. A map of people who dared to begin again. One evening, Frank and Michael sat on the porch in Cedar Springs, watching the stars. Emily had brought out lemonade, and the night was thick with crickets and pine. Michael said, You know what I realized? What's that? Frank asked. All those years I stayed away. I thought you were building things to avoid the pain. But now I see, you were building things because of the pain. Frank nodded slowly. It's what saved me. Giving shape to what I couldn't say. That's what I'm trying to do now, Michael said. I don't want to waste any more time being silent. Frank reached over and clasped his son's shoulder. Then don't. Say what needs to be said. Build what needs to be built. Michael smiled. Sounds like something Elon Musk would say. Frank laughed. Nah. Elon's the spark. But we're the fire. The stars above blinked like old ideas waiting to be rediscovered. And beneath them sat two men, once broken, now whole again, not perfect, not finished, but alive. Still building. Frank was repairing a cracked table leg in the workshop when the call came. He almost let it go to voicemail. The spam calls had gotten relentless since the movement had grown, but something in his gut told him to answer. Hello, he said, not even looking at the screen. Is this Frank Watson? The voice on the other end was clear, calm, and had that rehearsed politeness that comes from too many media trainings. Yes, who's calling? My name is Monica Ray. I'm with the United Nations Department of Aging and Innovation. Frank raised an eyebrow. That's a thing? It is now, she said with a light laugh. Mr. Watson, we've been following your work with the Late Bloomers Project. It's been making waves, not just nationally, but globally. We're building an initiative to rethink aging and purpose, and we'd like to invite you to speak at the World Forum on Intergenerational Innovation in Geneva this fall. Frank blinked, dropping the screwdriver he was holding. It clattered to the ground. You want me to speak? In Switzerland? Yes, Monica said warmly. Your story is more than a story now. It's a movement. And it's reshaping how people think about aging in real time. Frank sat down slowly on the workbench, heart thudding. He hadn't left the country in decades. The furthest he'd been in the last year was Oregon. The idea of flying overseas, of standing in front of world leaders, business titans, academics, it was dizzying. I don't know, he said. I'm just a guy who writes blog posts and fixes things in a shed. Monica paused. With respect, sir, you're a man who helped thousands of people remember they still matter. The world could use a little more of that. Frank promised to think about it. That night, he sat in the living room with Emily and Michael, the invitation still fresh in his mind. They want me to speak at a global summit, he said, as if repeating it might make it more believable. I haven't spoken in front of a crowd bigger than the Cedar Springs Rotary since the Louisville event. And that almost gave me a panic attack. Emily set down her tea. You always said you wanted to change how people saw aging. This is a bigger platform to do it. Michael nodded. And you won't be alone. We'll go with you. Frank looked at them. His daughter and son, both grounded, both wise, both fiercely supportive. I'm scared, he admitted. Good, Michael said. It means it matters. 3 months later, Frank stood backstage at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, clutching his speech in one hand and his wedding ring in the other. He wore a dark blazer, jeans, and a small late bloomers pin on his lapel. Michael had helped him trim his speech. Emily had helped him rehearse it. The room beyond the curtain was filled with delegates from 67 countries. Behind him, a monitor showed the live stream view, the words redefining purpose after 60, a new frontier glowed across the top. A tech assistant gave him a thumbs up. Frank nodded. Then the lights dimmed, the music faded, and the host introduced him, from Cedar Springs, Kentucky, please welcome Frank Watson, founder of the Late Bloomers Project. Applause. A spotlight. And then, Frank walked out. The stage was massive, the audience distant, but he felt a strange calm settle over him. He approached the podium, cleared his throat, and began. What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? A pause. The room stilled. What if the second half of your life wasn't a decline, but a beginning? What if age wasn't the end of invention, but the birthplace of it? He told his story. The bird feeder. The blog post. The quote from Elon Musk. The drone. The letter from his son. He didn't rush. He didn't try to sound like anyone else. He just told the truth, as he always had, and let the story do what it was born to do, light fires in the dark. He ended with this, we are not past our prime. We are the keepers of wisdom, the quiet rebels, the inventors who still dream. And we are not done. The applause was thunderous. Some stood. Others wept. The moderators rushed up, thanking him profusely. Delegates came backstage to shake his hand. A woman from Kenya invited him to speak at a similar event in Nairobi. A Japanese tech company asked if he'd consider helping advise a project about aging and robotics. It was surreal. Overwhelming. Electrifying. Back at the hotel, Michael handed him a drink and said, "You crushed it, Dad." Emily hugged him. "You've started something you can't stop now." Frank looked out at the Geneva skyline, lights glittering across the lake. "I don't want to stop," he said quietly. "But I want to guide it now. Not carry it." The next day, Elon Musk tweeted again, "Watched Frank Watson's speech from Geneva. Stunning. This is what the world needs more of. Courage without ego. Vision without vanity." The tweet went viral. Again. But by now, Frank wasn't shaken by virality. He was focused. Steady. Back in the States, things accelerated. Membership in the Late Bloomers Project doubled in a month. New chapters opened in Australia, Italy, and Brazil. Media outlets ran features with headlines like "The Man Who Taught the World to Begin Again." But with all the attention came challenges. Oversight boards. Licensing questions. Corporate sponsors who wanted to slap logos on things. Frank held firm. "We don't sell purpose," he said. "We protect it." He created a foundation. Not to monetize, but to scale wisely. To offer resources without strings. To train local leaders without centralizing power. He brought in experts, psychologists, technologists, community developers, to make sure the movement stayed human, not just inspirational. He said no to TV shows. Yes to documentaries. No to product lines. Yes to school programs that paired teens with retirees for mentorship and creativity projects. And through it all, he kept writing. One night, he posted a blog titled "When the World Starts Listening." In it, he wrote, "The scariest thing isn't being ignored. It's being heard. Because once people are listening, you have a responsibility, to speak truth, to stay humble, and to remember why you began." The bird feeder wasn't about birds. It was about building something, anything, to prove I still existed. That I could still create. That I still mattered. And if that's all anyone ever gets from this story, let it be this: you matter. You matter when no one claps. You matter when you're afraid. You matter when you're starting again at 70. Or 80. Or 90. You matter because you're still here. That post became the most shared article in the history of the Late Bloomers Project. People printed it and pinned it on bulletin boards. Read it at funerals. Tattooed lines from it on their skin. Frank was invited to meet the president. He declined. Not because he didn't care, but because he had a prior engagement, helping a retired welder finish a model train set he'd started in 1964. "That's where I'm needed," he told the White House scheduler. "Tell him I said thank you anyway." His refusal went viral, too. But that didn't matter to Frank. What mattered was that people were finally seeing their own lives as unfinished masterpieces. And choosing to finish them. On a quiet night in Cedar Springs, Frank stood in the workshop alone. Echo hung on the wall. The old blueprints corner had overflowed into 2 more rooms. There were shelves now. And digital archives. And volunteers everywhere. But here, in this moment, it was still just him. The same man who once stared into a bird feeder and wondered if life was over. He looked around, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Not bad for a late bloomer." Then he smiled. Because he knew now, late blooming wasn't about catching up. It was about blooming exactly when you were meant to. It was late autumn when she first walked into the workshop. The air outside had that crisp, electric chill that hinted winter was coming, and inside the old repurposed hardware store, the windows were fogged with the warmth of people building, soldering, carving. Frank was reviewing a prototype someone had sent in, an ex-firefighter from Boise working on a solar-heated bench for bus stops, when the door creaked open. She stepped in slowly, her red scarf drawing attention like a splash of paint on a winter canvas. She didn't look lost, but she did look uncertain, the way people often did when they weren't sure if they belonged. Frank had seen that look dozens of times. It was his own reflection not too long ago. "You looking for someone?" he asked gently, walking over. She glanced around, taking in the chaos, retirees laughing, wood shavings on the floor, someone playing a tinny old country song through a Bluetooth speaker. "I'm looking for a place to finish something I started," she said. Her voice was warm but firm, with that unmistakable rhythm of someone who had spent a life commanding rooms, not fading into them. "Well," Frank said, smiling, "you've come to the right place." She introduced herself as Marlene Jacobs. 72, retired physics teacher, formerly of Cincinnati, recently relocated to Cedar Springs after her husband's passing. "He always said I was too stubborn to sit still," she said with a half-smile. Turns out he was right. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in a worn dish towel. Inside was an old, dusty device, half circuitry, half mechanical, something between a weather balloon and a compass. "This was my senior thesis in 1973, she explained. "It's a directional energy harvester. The idea was to use motion, wind, movement, even walking, to power small devices. I shelved it after graduation. Life got in the way." Frank leaned in, examining it with reverence. "It's beautiful," he said honestly. "And you're saying you want to finish it now?" Marlene nodded. "I don't need it to change the world. I just want to finish what I started." Before the curtain call. Frank placed it gently on the worktable. "Then let's bring it back to life." Over the next few weeks, Marlene became a fixture in the workshop. Always in her red scarf, always with a thermos of spiced tea, always working with intense focus and occasional, muttered physics jokes no one understood except her. But it wasn't long before others gravitated toward her. She had that kind of presence. The quiet brilliance wrapped in kindness. She began mentoring others, helping veterans with circuitry, guiding a grandmother trying to build an electric rocking chair, even correcting Frank on a few minor engineering missteps with grace and a raised eyebrow. One afternoon, Michael sat beside Frank, watching Marlene instruct a group of younger volunteers on voltage regulation. "You know," Michael said, "she's like the Marie Curie of Kentucky." Frank chuckled. "I was thinking more like the Jedi Master of unfinished dreams." As the energy harvester came to life, first a flicker, then a steady pulse, people began to gather around. It was symbolic, really. A machine powered by motion, reborn by the motion of a woman refusing to settle. When it finally powered a small light bulb, Marlene laughed, an honest, full-bellied laugh that echoed across the room. Everyone applauded. Frank stepped up beside her. "That light," he said, "that's your spark. It never went out. It was just waiting." She smiled, brushing away a tear. "I didn't know I needed this," she said. "Not just the project. The people. The belief. We all need it," Frank replied. "We just forget we're allowed to ask for it." Marlene's story hit the Late Bloomers blog the next morning, and within a week, it had been shared by every major tech site and science journal in the country. Emails flooded in from other women who had given up on dreams, shelved inventions, hidden away brilliance under the demands of family, duty, survival. One woman from Arizona wrote, "I'm 81. I invented a wind-powered irrigation pump in the 80s and never finished it. After reading Marlene's story, I pulled it out of storage. It still works. And so do I." Another, from Maine, "We weren't raised to believe we had time for ourselves. But maybe now, maybe we do." Frank and Marlene began co-hosting workshops, Late Bloomers Labs, they called them. Focused on women who had backgrounds in STEM, art, design. But never had the platform or permission to pursue them. "This isn't about reinvention," Marlene would say during introductions. "It's about reclamation." Frank watched with admiration, and something else, too. Something tender. Marlene reminded him of someone he had loved once. Maybe more than one. And though grief had a way of convincing you that new beginnings were for other people, not you, he found himself smiling more when she was around. Laughing differently. One day, over lunch, Frank asked her, "Why the red scarf?" Marlene looked out the window, her eyes soft. "My husband gave it to me when I got my first teaching job. He said it made me look like someone who knew exactly where she was going. Even when I didn't." Frank nodded. "It works." She smiled. "Funny thing is, I think I finally do know where I'm going. Took me 72 years. The bond between them grew quietly. No declarations. No pressure. Just the gentle rhythm of two people orbiting the same purpose. On a cold December evening, they found themselves walking home from the workshop under a light snowfall. "You ever think we were supposed to meet earlier?" Marlene asked. Frank thought for a moment. "If we had, we wouldn't have been ready." "Ready for what?" "For beginning again. Together." She looked at him, and for a long second, neither spoke. Then she said, "Well, then I'm glad we waited. Some things are worth it." That night, Frank wrote another post. He called it "The Light in Her Scarf." He didn't name her, but the story was unmistakable. He ended with this line: "Sometimes the light you've been chasing your whole life walks through the door wearing a red scarf and reminds you, you're not finished yet." The post went viral again. But this time, it wasn't just about movement or invention. It was about connection. About love, not the young kind, but the enduring kind. The kind that finds you in the winter of your life and makes everything bloom again. Letters poured in. From widowers. From women rediscovering purpose. From people who had believed love was no longer an option. "You gave me hope," they wrote. "Hope that it's not too late." Frank didn't reply to all of them. But he read every word. Because he knew how sacred hope was. How rare. And how vital it was to protect it. Marlene stayed. She bought a little cottage a few blocks from the workshop. They didn't define their relationship with labels. They didn't need to. But every morning, she brought tea. And every night, he walked her home. Cedar Springs was starting to feel like the center of something much larger than a town. It was becoming a movement's heartbeat. A place where people came to remember what they'd forgotten, that they were still alive. That their best ideas hadn't expired. That they were still worthy of being seen, heard, loved. Frank stood one morning outside the workshop, coffee in hand, as the sun rose over the rooftops. Marlene stepped beside him, red scarf fluttering in the wind. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Frank smiled. "That everything I ever needed walked through that door the day you did." She slipped her hand into his. "Well," she said, "good thing you answered." By spring, it was undeniable. The Late Bloomers Project had become a global movement. What had begun as one man's quiet rebellion against decline had grown into an international reimagining of aging itself. Across continents, stories poured in. In Mumbai, a former postal worker was building solar-powered scooters for elders. In Poland, a 78-year-old sculptor returned to marble for the first time in 4 decades, her studio now funded by a community art grant sparked by the late bloomers' philosophy. In Brazil, a group of retired dancers formed a traveling troupe called Second Wind, their performances drawing standing ovations from audiences half their age. The media started calling it the Frank effect. But Frank bristled at that. "It's not about me," he kept saying. "It's about what was already inside people. I just lit the fuse." Still, the requests kept coming. Keynotes. Panels. Podcasts. Documentary interviews. Most he declined. He wasn't chasing fame. He was protecting the fire. He chose instead to mentor the mentors, empowering regional leaders to carry the vision without diluting it. "I don't want a brand," he told Michael one evening as they worked on a new drone prototype. "I want a culture. Something that lives without needing my name stamped on it." Michael nodded. "That's what makes it real." At home in Cedar Springs, the workshop was expanding. Not just physically, but emotionally. It was no longer just a place to build things. It was where people came to become themselves again. Marlene now ran a weekly Restart Lab, where participants brought old dreams and reimagined them through modern tools. One woman in her 60s designed an app to track family recipes across generations. A man in his 70s re-engineered a broken jukebox to play digital music with a turn of a crank. The joy in those rooms was palpable. The kind that hummed in your chest and made you believe, deep down, that time had not passed you by, it had simply been waiting for you to say yes. Frank found himself waking each day with a new kind of hunger, not to prove anything, but to give. To show people that a blank page at 70 could be just as thrilling as one at 17. Then came the backlash. It started subtly. An op-ed in a major business journal questioning the economic viability of pumping money into late-life creativity. A news segment titled Too Late to Matter. The Late Bloomers movement under scrutiny. Frank read it all. Not with anger, but with recognition. He knew how systems reacted when people challenged the timelines they were handed. They're scared, he told Marlene one night. Not of us. Of what we represent. She sipped her tea. We represent proof that their rules aren't laws. And that terrifies anyone who's built power around limitations. A few weeks later, Frank was invited to a televised roundtable discussion hosted by a major global think tank. The topic, the future of aging, asset or burden. Frank almost declined. He didn't like debate for the sake of spectacle. But this one felt different. He needed to be there. When the night came, the panelists included economists, demographers, a futurist from Stanford, and a well-known political advisor known for his hard-nosed opinions on aging populations draining society. Frank listened as charts were shown. Curves about healthcare costs. Graphs on retirement burdens. The language was clinical. Cold. Sterile. Until finally, they turned to him. Mr. Watson, the moderator said. You've become a symbol of late-life reinvention. But how do you respond to the critics who say we should be investing in youth, not chasing the past? Frank took a breath. Looked into the camera. Then he said, I'm not chasing the past. I'm refusing to be erased. The room went still. He continued. We talk about aging as if it's a drain. But let me ask this, how much wisdom have we buried in nursing homes? How many solutions to today's problems sit untapped because someone turned 70 and society decided they were finished? He leaned in. We don't stop being innovative because we age. We stop because no one expects us to start again. But what happens when we do? I'll tell you. We build drones. We write books. We launch programs that keep teenagers off the streets. We heal relationships. We dream again. And we teach everyone watching that life doesn't end, it unfolds. The panelists sat silent. The audience broke into applause. After the broadcast, the response was staggering. Thousands of messages. Not just from elders, but from younger people, too. A 25-year-old from Chicago wrote, I'm not afraid of getting older anymore. A high school senior in Texas messaged, I showed your clip to my grandma. She signed up for a coding boot camp the next day. Frank forwarded those messages to the team with a simple note, this is why. But the attention brought other things, too. Calls from governments. Proposals for public-private partnerships. Invitations to consult on national aging policy. Frank sat with Michael, Marlene, and a few trusted advisors in the back room of the workshop. A whiteboard was filled with options. Timelines. Risks. Opportunities. We can't do everything, Michael said. So what matters most? Frank tapped the words local first. Always. On the board. We build what scales through trust. We don't franchise purpose. We cultivate it. And so, the Late Bloomers Fellowship was born, a global mentorship network that paired retired professionals with underserved communities to build real-world solutions. Not advice. Not lectures. Co-creation. Retired engineers helped teens build solar panels in Detroit. Former seamstresses partnered with refugees in France to open a clothing co-op. A 70-year-old marine biologist in Australia led beach cleanups with grade schoolers, turning data collection into science lessons. Each project followed the same rule: we don't give from the past. We give from the present. Frank watched it all unfold with quiet awe. He no longer had to steer every decision. The movement had grown legs. A voice. A conscience. It was living. One evening, Frank sat on the porch with Marlene, watching a thunderstorm roll in. The air was thick, charged. He looked over at her. "You ever think we've just scratched the surface?" She smiled. "Of course. You think seeds stop once they sprout?" He chuckled. "You always say the right thing." She looked at him, eyes soft. "You always make room for people to bloom." Lightning cracked across the sky. Frank leaned back, letting the rain begin to fall gently on his boots. The world was watching now. But more importantly, it was changing. Not fast. Not perfectly. But undeniably. In classrooms, teenagers were learning about neuroplasticity and late-life creativity. In boardrooms, retirement policies were being reimagined to include sabbaticals for personal reinvention. In hospitals, therapy programs now included purpose-focused planning for post-retirement care. In homes around the globe, people were asking new questions: what haven't I done yet? What have I shelved? What if I'm not done? Frank knew the data would eventually catch up to the reality. But that wasn't his concern anymore. His concern was the people still on the edge, the ones sitting in quiet kitchens, wondering if their best days had already come and gone. For them, he kept writing. Kept building. Kept showing up. Because he knew the truth. Knew it in his bones. The world had been designed to count people out. But he had seen what happened when they counted themselves back in. They didn't just change their lives. They changed the world. One unfinished dream at a time. It was a letter. Not an email. Not a DM. Not a comment on one of the posts or a story submission through the Late Bloomers portal. A real letter, on textured paper, addressed in cursive handwriting that looked like it belonged to another time. Frank found it one morning in the workshop's mailbox, tucked between packages of drone parts and another unsolicited offer from a publisher. No return address. Just, to Frank Watson. He slipped it into his back pocket, carried it around for half the day. Part of him didn't want to open it. That handwriting, it stirred something. A memory not fully formed, but familiar. Later, when the sun was slanting low and the workshop had emptied out, he sat by the window with a mug of black coffee, unfolded the paper, and began to read. "Frank, you probably don't remember me. Or maybe you do. It's been almost 50 years. But I saw the Geneva speech. A friend sent me the link. And I couldn't not write you after that. You once told me that if we ever did something worth sharing, we should send a letter instead of a call. Letters mean it lasts, you said. I always remembered that. My name's Evelyn." Frank stopped reading. Evelyn. He hadn't said that name aloud in decades. He leaned back in his chair, the sound of a wind chime echoing faintly through the open door. Evelyn had been his first love. His real one. Not the high school crush, not the summer fling. Evelyn was the woman he'd nearly moved to New York for. The woman who used to read aloud Neruda poems to him in her apartment above the old bookstore. She had a laugh that made silence feel sacred. They had met in college. Fell fast. Almost married. But life happened. Careers. Cities. Missteps. Fear. And now, this letter. He read on. I live in Vermont now. Ran a small theater for years. Never married. Came close, twice. But it never felt quite right. I won't lie to you. Seeing you up there on that stage, talking about starting over, about lost time and unfinished work, it hit me like a punch. Not in a bad way. But in the way that makes you sit very still and realize, there's still more left. Even for me. I don't know why I'm writing, really. Maybe just to say, thank you. For waking something up in me that I thought had gone quiet. If you're ever near Burlington, Evelyn. Frank folded the letter slowly. Held it in his hands for a long while. Then he stood, went to the cabinet, and pulled out a pen. He sat down at the workbench and wrote back. 3 weeks later, he found himself stepping off a train into a quiet Vermont station. He carried a small duffel, no fanfare. He didn't tell Michael. Or Marlene. Not because he was hiding it, but because some journeys need silence before they can speak. Evelyn was waiting outside. She hadn't changed much, somehow. Her hair was silver now, pulled back in a loose braid. Her posture was proud, her presence the same magnetic calm he remembered. She wore a green wool coat and a scarf wrapped tight around her neck. Well, she said, you're still taller than I remember. Frank smiled. And you still look like you're about to quote Mary Oliver. She laughed. I do that more than I should. They walked. Not toward anywhere in particular, just through the small town, past bookstores and bakeries and lamplit sidewalks. They talked about nothing, which is to say, they talked about everything. Frank told her about Cedar Springs, the late bloomers, Echo, Marlene. Evelyn told him about the plays she directed, the bookstore she rescued from bankruptcy, the kids she mentored, the poems she still read aloud when the world felt too loud. That night, they sat in her living room drinking tea, surrounded by books and paintings and old theater posters. Do you regret it? She asked suddenly. What we didn't do? Frank considered. I used to, he admitted. But then I started building again. Not just things. Myself. And I realized maybe we weren't supposed to last back then. We weren't ready. She nodded slowly. But we're not back then now. The sentence lingered in the space between them. Soft. Honest. Hopeful. Frank didn't rush to fill it. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. No promises. No pretenses. Just presence. He stayed 3 days. They walked along the lake. Cooked simple meals. Read poetry aloud again. She gave him a book of her favorites as he packed to leave. Inside the front cover, she'd written, "Come back soon. There's still more of the story." E. On the train ride home, Frank stared out the window, the green blur of trees passing like thoughts. He didn't know what it meant yet. Not exactly. But he knew it mattered. That something inside him had softened. Reopened. That the past didn't always return to haunt you. Sometimes it returned to remind you that not everything lost was meant to stay gone. Back in Cedar Springs, the workshop was buzzing. A group of late bloomers from Sweden had flown in to observe. Michael had installed a new solar lighting system. Marlene met him at the door, a gentle look in her eyes. You okay? She asked. Better than, he said. Something opened. That evening, he gathered everyone and told the story. Not as a confession, not as a drama, just as another chapter in the unfolding truth. Sometimes, he said, the things we shelve aren't inventions or skills. They're people. Memories. Parts of ourselves we thought had no place left. But sometimes, they're just waiting. For a letter. A second chance. A different kind of courage. That night, Marlene slipped her hand into his, and they walked in silence. Not threatened by the past, not afraid of what it might mean, but settled in the knowledge that life was not a competition between the people we've loved. It was a mosaic. And if we were lucky, we got to see the full pattern before the end. The next week, the Late Bloomers site launched a new series, Reunions. Stories of lost connections, rekindled friendships, forgiven wounds. One woman found her war buddy after 60 years. A man wrote to the son he'd given up for adoption in 1972. A retired nurse found the family of a patient she'd never forgotten. Each story was different. But the theme was the same: it's never too late to reach back. Not to stay there, but to carry something forward. Frank wrote the introduction to the series himself. We talk a lot about moving on. About closure. But what if life isn't always asking us to close the door? What if it's asking us to knock? Gently. Honestly. Bravely. And say, I'm still here. The world listened. Again. And somewhere, in a quiet house in Vermont, a woman with silver hair read his words and smiled. Because she knew they were for everyone. And maybe just a little, for her. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?